this is another one of those days where we had, a whole show planned, and everything has gone out the window. As we have followed stuff that come up that we didn't expect. We are now tonight following two very dramatic and still developing stories that we really had no idea we should be expecting. In one case, 24 hours ago, and in the other case, as recently as 2 hours ago. It's just another one of those days. But I'll tell you, the first story we are keeping an eye on tonight broke open with a shock at dawn this morning when Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido appeared in this video message at a Venezuelan Air Force base just outside Venezuela's capital city of Caracas. In this video this morning, Juan Guaido announced that the Venezuelan military was now siding with him. And the time had come for the Venezuelan people to rise up and oust Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela's presidential palace. And of course, this standoff in Venezuela, whether or not you've been following it closely, you are at least aware in an ambient sense that this standoff has been brewing for months, and the Venezuelan people have been in extremis for months. But part of the shock of what happened today is that Guaido appeared alongside his mentor, a longtime charismatic opposition leader in Venezuela, a Harvard and Princeton-trained economist named Leopoldo Lopez, who has been imprisoned as a flat-out political prisoner in Venezuela since 2014. Today, Guaido and Lopez explained that Lopez was out today, no longer in prison, that he was able to stand there alongside Juan Guaido because he was freed today by Venezuelan soldiers who had switched sides and who are now aligning themselves with Guaido, with the opposition, and supporting this effort to oust Maduro. So it was this shock announcement at dawn, and it set off demonstrations and violent clashes all day long today. And we have been following this all day today, trying to figure out the fate of this country, right? There have been, importantly, conflicting and contested reports about the split allegiances of the country's powerful military. Everybody sees that as the key, at least a key dynamic as to how this is ultimately going to resolve and when. And when you're trying to track the divided loyalties of the military, yes, that is as scary as it sounds and as dangerous as it sounds for the civilians who are caught up in all of this. Internationally, Maduro is supported by very powerful allies, including China and Russia, plus also Bolivia and Cuba. On the other side, it's the government of the United States and Canada and many other Latin American and European countries who don't just oppose Maduro, they formally recognized Guaido, the opposition leader, as the legitimate leader of that country. It's that split in world opinion as to who is the official president of Venezuela. That is why there's been all of this energy exerted today over whether or not you should call what happened in Venezuela today a coup. I mean, etymologically speaking, you can't launch a coup. You can't be overthrowing a government if technically you are the person who is already in charge of that government. So that's why people are fighting over whether or not to call this a coup. Honestly, it is a semantic distinction that is probably not worth the breath at this point, given the risk and the drama on the ground in Venezuela as this actual fight for the control of the government and the military and the country at large unfolds in a way that is just happening on the street and is totally unpredictable and scary, particularly for a country that has been through so much pain in recent months. So the news out of Venezuela, the visuals out of Venezuela have been frightening and surreal all day. A lot of news organizations today played footage of what appeared to be National Guard vehicles running down protesters in the street. I am not going to show that video. But it has been hard to watch and dramatic and scary and fascinating to watch all day. I will also tell you that that news took a dramatic and odd turn quite late in the day, early evening, when U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo weighed in a very specific way. He cryptically announced in a couple of interviews that the U.S. government has learned that Maduro was about to flee his country in the face of this uprising and these demonstrations by Guaido and the supporters of the opposition, with some unquantified amount of support from the military. Pompeo announced that the U.S. government had learned that Maduro was going to go to the airport, get in a plane, and flee the country. He was going to fly to Cuba. But according to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, the Russians intervened and told him to stay put and not leave. Mike Pompeo then, even more cryptically, threatened that Maduro knew what the United States would do if he, in fact, got on that plane and flew to Cuba. Pompeo told CNN, quote, "Mr. Maduro understands what will happen if he gets on that airplane. He knows our expectations." He would not say what that is that will happen. He would not explain what those expectations are. I mean, if the U.S. is supporting the opposition leader who is leading the uprising, and Maduro is trying to flee, presumably the U.S. would want that, right? Would want him to leave. So now the U.S. is threatening him if he leaves, and if he leaves, something might happen, and you know what it is. I mean, what are you threatening with? You're going to give him $50 because he's left, and that's what he wanted? I mean, I don't mean to point out the obvious here, but while we were watching this absolutely history-making eventuality today in that country, it really felt like the U.S. government had no idea what it was talking about and had no plan for what was going on here, which is maybe something they should have cooked up when they decided to declare that this opposition leader would be the new president of that country. I mean, in any previous administration, good ones, bad ones, hawkish ones, dovish ones, any previous U.S. administration, a U.S. Secretary of State making an announcement like that, the Russians blocked him from leaving, and he knows what'll happen when it comes to us if he does leave. I mean, that would be a momentous and shocking moment, right? A U.S. Secretary of State saying that would signal some sort of serious potential international conflict involving potentially some of the world's great nuclear-armed powers. In this administration, though, yeah, it was Mike Pompeo, and who really knows what any of it meant? It has just been a chaotic response from the U.S. government all day today, including lots of statements released by various U.S. government officials today, supposedly intended directly for the Venezuelan people. But apparently it never occurred to anyone in the Trump administration that any of those statements should be in Spanish, let alone that they should be delivered by any means of communication that the Venezuelan people actually have any access to after the Maduro regime has cut everything off. So I know there's a lot going on, but this is a very serious, very fluid, very much still developing situation in Venezuela today. We're going to have more on that ahead later on this hour, and we're watching this as developments proceed because, as I say, this is international history in the making. Whether or not you have been paying any attention to the drama and tragedy in Venezuela over the past year, this tonight, as we speak, in some ways it really feels like it may be the pivotal moment when either the Maduro regime is going to end somehow, or the Maduro regime is going to survive, in which case the opposition is going to be in the most perilous, literally the most physically perilous place they have yet been in. And that involves untold numbers of civilians and who knows what split of the military. And so the whole world really is watching this. And for us Americans watching at home, one of the sideshows we are watching here is our own government's inexplicable, self-defeating, bungling hash of a response. And, it doesn't matter if you like this particular U.S. government or not, whether you like this particular presidential administration or not, every American has an interest in seeing our own government at least handle something like this responsibly, right? At least handle it with basic competence, with a basic ability to speak in ways that make sense, to be understood, and to act rationally. Instead, we've got these guys. It's just been a remarkable spectacle.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.